Hey, how are you? Welcome back to our channel. We're still reading a collection of Alan Watts' lectures from the 60s. And today we're going to look at chapter 3, which is about Zen Buddhism. Watts starts out with giving us an idea of, the origin and style of Zen Buddhism. And he says that it's an offshoot of Mahayana Buddhism, and it's sort of like the way it was adapted to Chinese and Japanese culture. And in terms of the style, Zen is not trying to, represent anything but what actually is. So if you picture, for instance, a Zen garden, there's no images or symbols, there's just natural rock and raked sand. So the style of Zen Buddhism could best be described as simple, rugged and unpretentious. We then look at the relationship between spirituality and nature, and Watts juxtaposes, the Western approach, which is of course generalized, but we all know what we mean by Western approach. So he juxtaposes that with, the approach that Zen Buddhism takes. So in the Western world, he says, people tend to, and again, that's painted with a really broad brush, but never mind. So in the West, we tend to distinguish between, having a soul and a body, or at least that's what people usually sort of think, that there's a difference between the soul and the body, between spirit and matter. And since we make that distinction, we sort of think of the spiritual to be out of this world, or set apart from the world that we see around us. And we also tend to think of human beings as sort of separate from the natural world. We're sort of in the natural world, but not necessarily part of it. And by sort of identifying with, the soul, our attitude towards nature becomes one of strife. We sort of juxtapose ourselves, with nature. So we tend to want to conquer or dominate or master nature. So that's sort of like Alan Watts' encapsulation of what we in the West do. And in contrast, Chinese and Japanese Zen culture concentrates much more on the everyday life. So their attitude about the relationship of man and nature is completely different. In Zen Buddhism, the everyday world is not so much a problem that needs solving or addressing, and life is regarded more of like a flow, of a process in which human consciousness is interwoven, and human beings are not seen as sort of separate entities observing the process from outside, as it were, but they are, as I said, interwoven into the process. So that's just some major differences between, the approach of the Western world and Zen culture. The actual meaning of Zen, Zen is the Japanese word for the Chinese word Chan, which in turn is the Chinese pronunciation of the Indian Sanskrit word jhana. So if you try to translate that term roughly, it would mean meditation, concentration, but the best way to actually capture the meaning is being free from distraction or having total presence of mind. And according to Zen Buddhism, the ideal state of human being is to be fully in the present. You could also describe that as kind of like being in a flow state, So if you're completely into something, into something that you're doing, you tend to forget yourself. And that's the kind of state that, Zen Buddhism regards as ideal. The next thing that Alan Watts goes into is something called Wu Shin. It's a Chinese expression. And what it means is basically no self. So it's this sort of like forgetting yourself, or being unaware of the self, which is called Wu Shin. So while this is deemed to be the desired state of mind in Zen Buddhism, it's quite apparent that most of us, most people are generally quite distracted. So, and not at all in the sort of here and now, and therefore much entangled with the idea of being that I or being that self. So it's not at all a modern phenomenon. This has always been sort of the problem of human beings. And attaining peace of mind in order to invite such a flow state has always been what sort of preoccupied Buddhist disciples. To best illustrate how Zen masters would approach this, this sort of conundrum of being distracted and being involved too much, involved with this idea of having a self. I'm going to read you a quote that kind of illustrates this struggle, and also how a Zen master would potentially solve it or attempt to solve it. A Chinese monk by the name of Huiko came to Bodhidharma with the usual troubles that afflict us all, and he said, "Master, I have no peace of mind. Please pacify my mind." And so Bodhidharma, who was a gruff old boy, said, "Bring your mind out here before me. I'll pacify it." And Huiko said, "But when I look for my mind, I can't find it." And Bodhidharma said, "There, it's pacified." So the point is, Huiko, the student, had an actual insight, in the meaning of Zen, because he realized that his mind was not something actual, not something concrete, not something physical. And when he realized that, he couldn't find it to be that, and that it just wasn't there, this realization is what pacified it. So you might ask yourself, well, how can you attain peace of mind when there's not such a master around, that you can ask and who can play tricks on you? And there's a bunch of schools, obviously, in Buddhism that focus on different aspects of how to get there. And one of them is to try and sort of iron out having thoughts in the first place, which is kind of borderline suppression of, thoughts, emotions, feelings, and can lead to all kinds of problems. It's kind of harks back to what we've discussed in the last chapter, is, when you try to push something away, you tend to make it stronger. And as long as you think there's something to be gotten rid of, you sort of actualize it, So if you think you need to get rid of your ego, you're actually making it stronger. And another way is to simply realize, that there is no such thing as an ego, that it is really just a byproduct of, having sensory experiences. It's a concept. So there's no one and there's no thing, to whom thoughts happen, to whom experiences happen. So ultimately, there is also no past, there's only present. And if you're sort of hung up on the idea of having or being a self, then that is what is sort of standing in your way of being fully present. I would suggest that there's a big difference in understanding this intellectually and actually, having understood this fully with your whole being. And what I also would submit is that in a lot of cases, this actual sort of understanding, which goes way beyond intellectual understanding of the fact that you don't have an ego, or that you are not an ego or a self, usually comes with going through a crisis point in your life, when sort of everything falls apart around you, or your life just is in shambles, it's much easier to actually recognize that there is no such thing as an ego or a self, which is ironic, and I don't think that one necessarily has to go through a crisis, to realize that, but it tends to happen that way. And in that connection, in that sort of context, there's this term, ego death or dark night of the soul, that's sort of like this. That's what happens when you have this realization. It's quite painful in the beginning, but it usually is paired with, it's quite painful, but then once you realized it, which is sort of like a momentary realization, it doesn't take a long time, it just sort of happens. It's like more of having an insight. Once that happened, you tend to experience the opposite of, despair. You tend to experience great joy, because it's actually quite liberating, not to be this confined, and not to identify yourself with either your body or your imagined ego. Alan Watts gives a piece of advice of how to be in the now, or in the flow state. And what he suggests is that, since we're talking about Zen Buddhism, which is anchored in everyday life, so he suggests that you should just always focus on the task at hand, just always focus on the next step, whatever you're doing. So whatever's in front of you, just focus on that, and don't think too far out, so when you eat, you eat, when you walk, you walk, when you work, you work, and whatever you do, just simply be there and be all there. And I would suggest that's actually quite a useful way to meditate, really, because if you think about it, if meditation is just sitting on a pillow somewhere in total silence, I mean, you can do that, of course, but I would submit that it doesn't take you to the actual goal any faster than if you try to incorporate meditation into your daily life, which can be, something stupid as washing dishes. You wash one dish at a time, and so life becomes kind of enjoyable, because when you're not projecting a imagined illusionary sense of I or me into the far future, you're not trapped in that hamster wheel of trying to get somewhere all the time, but you're here, and whatever is here. And if you can accept that, that's a much more chilled sort of way of living, and that's, I guess, what Buddhism suggests you do, and Zen Buddhism in particular in this case. Anyway, that was the third chapter. There's actually an original recording of this lecture by Alan Watts. I'm going to link that in the description box below. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.